Welcome. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of Fallsmon et Drisha. Welcome to the 7th session of Exodus Marching to Sinai with Rabbi David Silber. This class is a continuation of Rabbi Silber's series going through Tanakh for the past several years. A careful study of the story of Exodus as the narrative leads to the revelation at Sinai. Rabbi Silber is the dean and founder of Drisha, and it's been a pleasure to learn with him for all this time. Today's sources will come from Tanakh. If you have a Tanakh that you prefer, you are always welcome to follow along on your own. I will also be sharing sources from Sfaria on screen. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, so we started last week the story of Amalek, which is found towards the end of chapter 17 of Sefer Shemot, chapter 17, verse number 8. Vayavo Amalek. Amalek comes, Vayilachem im Yisrael birfidim, and they waged war against Israel in Refidim. We started that last week. Let me just say a few things about Amalek. Amalek is very important, obviously. Appears in the Torah in several places. And in terms of rabbinic literature, it's one of the central ideas. Of course, it's central to Megillat Esther. Haman is Hamana Agagi. Agag is the king of Amalek. So let's begin by seeing just where Amalek is found in the Torah. And then we can ask ourselves the second question, which is, Vayavo Amalek, why does Amalek come? Why? What is their motive here? Vayavo Amalek. So first of all, where we find that, first of all, who is Amalek? Let's start with that. Who is Amalek? So the clearest, one thing that's clear is that Amalek is found in Sefer Breshit, and Amalek is found in the genealogy of Esav. The Torah devotes a chapter in Sefer Breshit to Esav, chapter 36, and there's a long chapter about Esav's family. And within that chapter, it mentions that Esav's oldest son is named Eliphaz, and Eliphaz had a Pilegesh, had a concubine, and they have a child named Amalek. So Amalek essentially is the son of Eliphaz through this concubine, and Amalek is actually then Esav's grandson. We have to remember that at all times. Amalek is Esav's grandson. That's who Amalek is, okay, in chapter 36 of Sefer Breshit. But Amalek then is found in a few other places in the Torah. Of course, in our chapter, Vayavo Amalek, Amalek comes and attacks Israel in Refidim, in chapter 17. Then we have Amalek also. Amalek is also found in the story of the spies in the book of Bamidbar, the story of the spies. The spies come back and they tell about the land. It's a good land, they say, but the people there are too strong for us. And then they end up saying it's a land that it devours its inhabitants, etc. But in reporting who lives there, I'll just read you what they say. They come back, chapter 13 of Bamidbar, and the land is flowing with milk and honey, but the people are very strong. Amalek Yoshev B'Eretz HaNegev, V'Achiti V'Yevusi V'Emori Yoshev Bahar, V'Aknani Yoshev Al-Hayam, V'Yad HaYarden, chapter 13, verse 29. I'll read it to you in the English now. They're talking about the powerful people in the land and why they can't go. And they say actually, they say the Amalek dwells in the south. The Amalek dwells in the south. The Hittites, the Yevusi, and the Amorites inhabit the hill, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Amalek Yoshev B'Eretz HaNegev, and then we know the story that, and they say there are also giants in the land. It's essentially the spies say we can't possess the land. And then they're all crying and this and that. And towards the end of the next chapter, a group comes to Moshe and says, we decided we made a mistake. We want to fight. And Moshe says to them famously at the end of chapter 14, story of the Mapilim, don't do it. God is not with you. God's not going to go with you. The ark remains in the camp. They go and try to fight. Moshe stays behind. And it says in the last verse of chapter 14, in their defeat, their failure to capture the land, the first attempt to capture the land, which fails. The Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that hill country came down and dealt them a shattering blow at Hormah. So there we have Amalek. The first attempt to capture the land, the Canaanites and Amalek stop that, defeat them. And then we find Amalek again mentioned, actually, one more time in the Torah. Well, there's another time as well I'll get to, but it's mentioned also in the prophecies of Bilam, also in Sefer Bamidbar. There, Amalek is mentioned in two senses in Bilam's prophecies. First of all, Bilam has three prophecies and then a fourth prophecy. He's hired to prophesy, to curse the Jews, to get God to curse the Jews. That fails. He fails on three occasions. He gets fired from his job. And after he gets fired, as he's leaving, he says, you know something? I'll throw one in for free. And he has a fourth prophecy. But in the prophecies of Bilam, let me find which prophecy it is. I believe it's the third prophecy. Let me see. Yes, it is the third prophecy. Yaakov, we have in that prophecy. It talks about Israel, and it says, Yisal mayim midoyom v'zaro b'mayim rabim v'yarom me'agag malko v'tina se malchuto. Bilam prophesied about Israel, chapter 24, book of Bamidbar. I'll read it to you. Their boughs drip with moisture, their roots have abundant water. Their king shall rise above Agag. Their kingdom shall be exalted. Agag, we know Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. V'yarom me'agag malko. That may be one reference to Amalek, certainly Agag. But then, in the next chapter, as he's leaving, and he throws in his prophecy for nothing, he sees different nations. And in verse 20 of chapter 24, Vayaret Amalek, he sees Amalek. Vayisa Mishalo Vayomar, he takes up his theme and he says, Reshit Goyim Amalek. Amalek is a leading nation. Reshit Goyim. V'yacharito, but its fate, its end, Adei Oved, is to perish forever. So there's like Rosh and Sof. Reshit Goyim means it's the first, most of the beginning. Reshit Goyim Amalek in verse 20 of chapter 24 of Bamidbar. But V'yacharito Adei Oved. So that's where we have Amalek in the Torah. But we also have Amalek in one other place, or at least the word Amalek is mentioned in one other place, which is very strange. And maybe we'll come back to that today or maybe next week. But that is actually in chapter 14 of the book of Breshit. Chapter 14, we read it just a few weeks ago. I'm sure we all remember it, but I'll anyway mention what it is, which is, that's the story where the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and the 4 kings defeat the 5 kings, and the 4 kings take the people of Sodom hostage, and they take Lot hostage, and Abraham saves Lot and saves all the captives. But in the context of that story, it first talks about the 4 kings' foray into the land of Canaan, and the different peoples that they defeat when they go into the land of Canaan. And amongst those that the 4 kings defeat, 4 powerful kings, they defeat the Zuzim, the Rephaim, Vayakuit Rephaim, Zuzim, Amim, the dreadnoughts, the Chori, Vayashuvu, Vayavo al Ein Mishpat Ukadesh, Vayakuit Kol Sedei HaMoleki, V'gamet Emori Hayoshe B'Chatzitzon Tamar. So it says they turned back, maybe on their return. That's they headed back up north. They came to a place called Ein Mishpat in the 7th verse of chapter 14 of Bereshit, and they came to the territory of the Amalekites, really the field of the Amalekites, and they defeated it. Svayaku et Sedeo Amaleki, the Gamet to Emori, Hayoshev, and also the Amori who dwelt in Chatzatzon Tamar. Now that verse is very interesting because it mentions the field of the Amalekites in chapter 14 of Bereshit. But we know Amalek is the grandson of Esav. His birth is attested to in chapter 36. So what does it mean, the field of the Amalekites? What Amalekites? Amalek is Esav's grandson. So that's a very interesting verse. And I hope to talk more about this at some point, this week or next. I've spoken about it in the past. What you see from that is that apparently Amalek, let's leave out the question about Amalek isn't born yet. But in point of fact, Amalek is functioning in chapter 14 as some kind of a people. And these people are conjoined with the Emori on one hand, but the point of chapter 14, the peoples that are defeated by the 4 kings, the Rephaim, the Zuzim, and the Amim, these are the giants. These are maybe the giants that once lived in the land. The Nephilim that the Torah mentions in chapter 6 of Bereshit. And we all remember that when the spies come back and they report upon who lives in the land, so that we cannot capture the land, they're too powerful for us. They mentioned Amalek, they mentioned the Canaanites, and they mentioned the Nephilim. And there we saw the Nephilim. They saw us as grasshoppers, said the spies. We saw them as giants, and they saw us as grasshoppers. How do they know how do the spies know how they saw us? It's their own sense of who they are. They saw us. When we saw them, we saw ourselves as grasshoppers. And that's how they saw us. And the point is, when the spies come back, who's in the land that we have to capture? Yes, there are Canaanites, but there are giants in the land. And what's interesting is, keep this in mind, that Amalek in chapter 14 of Bereshit seems to be connected not just to Canaan, but the field of the Amalekites. The context is not just Canaan, or Emori actually is the one mentioned, but Rephaim, Amim, and Zuzim. These are the giants. So we'll come back to this. Is where Amalek is figuring in the Chumash. Now we move forward in Sefer Shemot. I want to talk more about Amalek, how it figures in more subtle ways in the Chumash. But this is who Amalek is. Now,
Rabbi Silber?
yes.
So those giants were kind of like primordial.
Yes.
So then a strain of them is still with us with the Amalekites then.
Right. So there's 2 ways to see Amalek. One way is to see Amalek as, let me just make this point now. The point I wanted to make about Amalek, or the 2 faces of Amalek. One is Esav's grandson. One is Esav's grandson, and I'll talk about that today. And what is motivating Amalek to attack us in the first place? Why is Vayavu Amalek? Amalek is not, we're not in the vicinity of Amalek in the desert. So what is it about? Why do they come? But the other claim I want to make is the following. Since you raised the point now, I'll make the claim right now, and we'll see where we go with this. And that is that Amalek actually is an instance of something else, which is, as I say, it's something which is rooted in the very beginning of the Chumash, and that is adversaries, basically of God. God's adversary. And God's adversary in the Chumash, and God's adversary is a very worthy adversary, very powerful adversary. That's the story of the Nachash in the story of Gan Eden. There is this snake, and the snake, wherever the snake is coming from, is very powerful. The snake seems to know more than the human being does. And the snake, for whatever reason, get to that, is determined to essentially upset God's plan. The plan of the Torah, God's plan in the second and third chapters of Breshit, is to establish within all of creation, to establish one place where God and God's beloved creature, the human being, can inhabit. God walks in the garden. They hear God mitalech bagan l'ruach hayom, and God places God's singular and beloved creation, the human being, in the garden, and God finds for the earthling a helpmate, and she's the Isha, and he becomes the Ish. That's the plan, and they can basically do whatever they want, except there's one tree, fruit which they cannot eat. But fundamentally, that's the idea. They're to work there, to guard the garden, to work there. Seems to me that's the ideal. So the first creation narrative is the God who creates everything, and the second creation narrative is the God who creates one special sacred place. And then we have suddenly the snake appears in the second story, in the second creation story, and the snake wants to defeat God's plan. Now, the claim that I've made in the past, the question is why? We always have to ask about motive. What is the motive of the snake? One could say, of course, that the snake needs no motive, because the snake is a snake. There's no motive. That's what snakes do. They do bad stuff. They're snakes. That's certainly one possibility. But if we search for a motive, then I think within our tradition we can find two motives. And I'll tell you the one that I thought of, and I'm sure it's within the tradition as well, whatever the sources may be, but the simple reading of the Chumash, in my view, is that what the snake doesn't like, what the snake resents, is the fact that God has taken this creation, this human being, and favored the human, and given the human all kinds of rights in the garden. And we remember, or should remember, at the very end of the first creation narrative, when God speaks to the human, and God gives the human permission to rule the world, as it were, but God also said in the last two verses of the first chapter of the Torah, God says, you human beings have the right to eat. You can eat all the vegetation, and you can eat all of the fruit. But as far as the animals are concerned, they may eat the vegetation. That's how chapter 1 ends. And I've mentioned several times that when I read those two verses, I said to myself, why does the Torah present? That's the end of the creation of the human being. You can have the fruit and the vegetation, and the animals can eat the vegetation. What a strange way to end. I would have ended with, and God created the human in God's image, or something like that. God blesses the human being. That'll be an appropriate ending to the glorious first chapter of the Torah prior to Shabbat. But no, the Torah does not end with that. It doesn't end with Tselem Elohim. It ends with, you can have the vegetation and the fruit, and the animals can have the vegetation. And what I suggested at the time, and I suggest now, is that those two verses actually are a lead into the next story. That's what bothers the snake. What bothers the snake is, how come you humans can eat the fruit? What does the snake say to the woman? The snake says to the woman, I heard you can't eat any fruit. That's the first thing the snake says. Did God say you can't have any fruit? Oh no, says the woman, we can eat all the fruit. There's this one tree that if we eat it, we may die. Sounds like it's not healthy or something like that. But the point is, when the snake says, I heard that God says you can't have any fruit, who was the snake really talking about? Answer, himself. He can't have any fruit. And he says to himself the following, why are they better than me? After all, the Torah uses the word arumim in that creation narrative twice. Once regarding the snake and once regarding the man and the woman. With the man and the woman, it means they were naked. Kind of innocence, childlike innocence, perhaps. But when it comes to the snake, hanachash haya arum, it doesn't mean naked. It means clever. I'm a room and they're a room. They're a room like babies, and I'm a room like I'm wise. They're better than me. They can have the fruit and I can't. What kind of God would do this? Did God say you can't have the fruit? What is that? What kind of God would say such a thing? And therefore, the snake's the enemy of the snake is not the human. The enemy of the snake is God, but, and here's the important but, you can't defeat God. You can't defeat God head on. And that's the point of the first creation narrative. It's the answer to Kasuto's question. Why did the Torah in chapter 1 of Genesis, when it talks about God creating sets of things, why did the Torah make an exception for the Tanin on the fifth day? So Kasuto has his answer. Because the Tanin in the other creation stories of the other cultures of the time or prior to the Torah, the Tanin, this great serpents, are there in the beginning of time, and they're part of the battle in the beginning of time between different forces. And says Kasuto, but the Torah says no, there's no other forces. God created the Tanin, the same God creates the trees, the fruit, it's all the same to God. And that's a very good answer. But there's another answer. Because the Torah, the Tanin and the Nachash are actually synonyms in the Torah. And the point is, God creates the Tanim, you can't fight with God. God's too strong. How can you defeat God? You can't defeat God if you take God head on. But you have to find God's weakness. Everything has a weakness. Now, where is God's weakness? God's weakness is the human being. That created B'Tselem Elohim. So the snake says, I'm going to get back at God. I know from my twin, the Tanim, you can't take God head on, of course. But you find the weak point. That's what snakes do. They hit you at the weak point. And the weakness of God is the human. At the end of the day, the snake, of course, convinces the woman to eat of the forbidden fruit, and the woman gives the man, and God comes and addresses each of them with a punishment. The man will suffer with work, women pregnancy, and difficulty with children, and the snake is cursed. You will crawl on your belly and live in the dust. What might say, death in life. And the scorecard at the end of that short story, here's what it says on the scoreboard. Here's the final score. Snake won, God nothing. Snake wins, God loses. God's a loser. Why? Because God's plan is disrupted. We have no Garden of Eden. That was God's plan. That's the whole plan. God plants the trees in Eden. God takes the human being. God addresses the human being. God finds a helpmate, a partner. At the end of the day, snake won, God nothing. Now, the snake is God's enemy, but the snake is also the human enemy. So the human being is representing God on earth, potentially representing God. It's the capstone of creation. So the snake wants to get back at God, but wants to attack God by attacking God's favorites, God's chosen ones. That's the snake. Now, the point is, when God addresses the snake, God says to the snake, Eva or sheet, I will create enmity between you and the woman and her descendants, between your descendants and her descendants. He will smite you in the head, and you will attack at the heel. Which is how snakes operate. They attack you at the heel, Achilles' heel. It's the weak point. It's the bottom of your body. You can't see it, and that's what snakes are. When you think about, the snake is the eternal enemy of God, and the eternal enemy of those that God has favored. And that's the snake. But the snake lives on in the Chumash because there's someone else who is represented in the Torah as God's enemy and also as Israel's enemy. And that, of course, is Amalek. And that's what we have in our chapter. In our chapter, it starts with Vayavo Amalek, with Amalek attacking Israel. When you read the end of the chapter, the end of chapter 17, our chapter, at the very end of the chapter, God instructs Moshe. So let's read those verses now. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, this is now in our chapter 17, verse number 14. 14, 15, 16. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Ketov zot zikaron basefer v'simbios ne Yoshua. Ki macho emche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim. God said to Moshe, write this down. Inscribe this in a book, in a document, as a zikaron, as a reminder. And make sure that Joshua, read it to Joshua, make sure Yoshua understands this. I will blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. That's the command to Moshe. But even Moshe Mizbeach, and Moshe built an altar. By he named the altar Hashem Nisi. God is Nisi. I'll come back to that later. By Yomer, he said, Ki Yod al Kesiyah, hand upon the throne of God. Hand upon the throne means what? That's an oath, right? When we swear in court, you hold the Bible, right? The Mishnah talks about Nikitat Chayfetz, when certain oaths require that you hold a Sefer Torah or maybe Tefillin, a mezuzah, whatever it is, that has God's name. Nikitat Chayfetz. Here it's God taking the oath. Yad al Kes Yah, Milchamah Hashem B'Amalek. God swears a war of God against Amalek, midar dar, in every generation. So the Amalek is unique, actually. We don't have this with anybody else. With Amalek, it's God's war against Amalek. That's what it says here. On the other hand, why must Yoshua be told about this? Symbios ne Yoshua. Now, Yoshua is Moshe's protege, Moshe's pupil, but Yoshua is also the general. He just fought the war against Amalek. In other words, when you fight Amalek, and only Amalek, when you're fighting Amalek, you're fighting God's war. And that's what it says here in chapter 17. And then in the Torah, in chapter 25 of Devarim, what we call Parshat Zachar, there it also enjoins us to remember Amalek. We're commanded to remember Amalek. And the end of chapter 25, the Torah says, Zachar, remember in verse 17, the very end of chapter 25 of Sefer Devarim, Zachar et asher asal lecha Amalek b'derech b'tzeitchem Mitzrayim. We'll come back to these verses. Remember what Amalek did to you when you were on the road, on the journey, when you left Egypt. Asher karcha b'derech, who karcha, here they say surprised you, but they engaged with you, literally chanced upon you maybe. Baderech, on the road. Difficult verse. They cut down all the stragglers in your midst. And you were very weary and tired. Below Yorei Elohim. And that's not clear what that refers to. And did not fear God. Does that refer to Israel who didn't fear God? Or does it refer to Amalek, who did not fear God? Let's see. Here the translation is, let's see. It doesn't seem, undeterred by fear means Amalek. They're translating that Amalek did not fear God. That's certainly possible. I think that's the primary, most understand it that way. I think it's not 100% clear. It could be, I'll come back to that as well. Anyway, after you've defeated the enemies about, or the other enemies about you, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Do not forget. Now, what's interesting is when you read the Parsha in Sefer Devarim, Parsha Zachar, there's no sense that this is God's war against Amalek. It's your war against Amalek. Remember what they did to you. You were coming, you were leaving Egypt, you were headed on your journey. They came and attacked you. They attacked you at the weakest points, the stragglers at the rear. You were tired and weary. And they were, or maybe you didn't fear God, or they don't fear God. And therefore, when you defeat the other enemies, blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Don't forget to do it. That's a different formulation than we have in our chapter, which is Milchamah Hashem b'Amalek midar dar. But my point is they're both true. Amalek is God's enemy. That's clear. Amalek is Israel's enemy. That's also clear. And therefore, we have a wonderful instantiation of the snake. So if we think of it this way, we have, I call it the two faces of Amalek. One face of Amalek is the snake, the war against God and anyone that God may choose. And the other is the Amalek of chapter 36 of Sefer Breshit. That's Esav's grandson. Now here, there's a difference between these two. They don't contradict each other. They often come together. The place they really come together, by the way, where you have both, is Megillat Esther. That's where they come together. But I'm not giving a share on the Megillah now, although one is always tempted to do so. But in any event, there is a difference actually between these two. And I'll tell you what it is, which is that the Amalek is Esav's grandson, is the enemy of the Jews, not the enemy of the world. Amalek is Esav's grandson, has it in for the Jews, has it in for Yaakov. Amalek resents Yaakov. I'll come back to that later. And that's a very important point. And there's a lot to be said about that. And actually, this week, we just read last week's parsha of Vayetze. This coming week is Vayishlach. Yaakov will meet Esav. These parashiyot, I'll tell you, they're amazing. Actually, you feel sad when we read Vayetze in 1 week. We should read it in 10 weeks. But anyway, there we have Yaakov and Esav, and the conflict of Yaakov. Remember when Rebecca goes to the oracle in chapter 25 of Breshit, what's going on inside me? And the oracle says, God says, Shnei goyim b'vitnech. You have two nations inside you. One shall be stronger than the other. And it's understood to mean they'll be in conflict forever. There's always going to be conflict there. Rav Yavod Sa'ir. It's not a story with a happy ending. It's a story with the two nations that will struggle with each other. When one is up, the other one is down. That's what we're told. That's what Rebecca is told. And in terms of Esav, if you think about Esav, we'll read it this coming Shabbat, actually. Yaakov meets Esav. When you read the story, actually, it sounds like Esav and Yaakov have made a pretty good arrangement. Esav's not going to fight with Yaakov. Esav is very magnanimous, even offers help to Yaakov. Yaakov, doesn't want his help. He says, I know, maybe someday, but not for now. You go ahead. But you read the story, it sounds like it's perfectly fine. And that's the Esav in Sefer Breshit. That's the Esav of Genesis, seems to forgive his brother. But when you read further in the Torah, though, Esav takes two forms in the Torah. One form is Edom. And Edom, in the Chumash, in Sefer Bamidbar, does not give permission for Israel to pass through his land to get to the promised land. Even threatens him. Comes out with an army, and Israel moves aside. That's one example of Esav. And then the other is Amalek. Amalek is Esav's grandson, and that's more negative. There, it's not. You want to pass through the land, you can't go through. This is Vayavo Amalek. They come to you to attack you. So these are the two faces of Amalek. And the difference is that the Nachash actually is primarily God's enemy, but the Nachash is the enemy of all humanity. Not the Jews specifically. The Nachash is the enemy of all humanity. So God says to the snake, I am between you and the woman and her descendants. Who are her descendants? Human beings. The Nachash is the enemy of the human being. Including the Jews, of course, but the enemy of the human being. But Esav's grandson Amalek, that's the enemy of the Jews. But the two go together. I personally believe that typically the enemy of the Jews is also the enemy of the human beings. That's what I believe. But it's my belief that Jews often are the first ones attacked. those that attacked the Jews typically would attack many others as well. I think history bears that out. Ancient history and present history as well, but that's not relevant to the Chumash. But this is the difference between the Nachash and Amalek of Esav. But they both
Rabbi Silber,
Yeah.
Silber, in the early story with Chava, I don't know. You read this thing, it was supposed to be a camel. You have any credence for that? I don't know. That it was supposed to be a camel and not a nachash, because it was sort of a dubious life. It had one kosher sign, but then it didn't have the other.
I have no idea about that.
No?
I never heard of such a thing. In the Chumash, it's obvious. It says Nachash in the Chumash. It's not a question. It says Nachash, and and the punishment crawl on your belly wouldn't apply to a camel. So I don't know. But these are the two faces of Amalek. Now, Vayavo Amalek. Now let's get back to our story over here. This is who Amalek is. Okay. Vayavo Amalek. Vayilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim. So first of all, when does Amalek actually come? So Amalek has come after these three stories. Amalek of chapter 17, verse number 8, follows the three stories that follow the crossing of the sea. And in each of those three stories, the same word appears, essentially. The word nes, or nisayon, appears in all three stories. In the first two, God is testing Israel. Luman anasenu, sham sam lo choku mishpat v'sham nisahu. There in Mara, in the first instance, God tests Israel. In the second instance, the purpose of the man is luman anasenu, that I test them, and we discuss what the test might be. But in the third instance, the story of Masa Umariva, Nasotamet Hashem. There, it's the opposite. There, God isn't testing us. There, we are trying or testing God. Nasotamet Hashem Lemar, Hayesh Hashem B'Kirbeinu Imayin. Is God in our midst? Is God in our presence or not? Even though God has been supporting us the whole time. What do you mean, is God in our presence? So therefore, there's a whole question. The people have a question about God in general. And that, of course, is a very negative story. Is God with us or not? And the next verse, Vayavo Amalek, Amalek comes and attacks. In the Chumash, in Sefer of Devarim, Parshat Zachar, Amalek attacked you, v'yato oyef v'yageya v'lo yorei Elohim. You were weary and tired, oyef v'yageya. And v'lo yorei Elohim is ambiguous. And either you didn't fear God, or they didn't fear God. But let's start with you didn't fear God. If it means that Israel didn't fear God, which fits in perfectly over here. In other words, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. If they're questioning whether God actually is in their presence, in their midst or not, after God has been assisting them all throughout, in Egypt, the plagues, crossing the sea, finding them water, giving them food to survive on, amon. What do you mean, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin? Here again, Refidim, Maso Mariva, more water. So that could be seen as V'lo Yarei Elohim. So Amalek attacks you. It's the first thing the Chumash says. Amalek attacks you when you are weak. And now the question is, what kind of weakness are we talking about? There are different kinds of weakness. There's one weakness when you're traveling on a journey. And in two different senses. One is the travel itself may be wearying. It's we traveled for many years in the desert. And we traveled in the desert not knowing if we'll have food tomorrow morning or not. We live on faith, but the food didn't last you. You couldn't save it. You can't save up anything. Every day is a new day. It's the story of the mud. So the travel itself, and also the travel is wearying in the sense that you don't have a place. When you're traveling from point A to point B, you're not in point A or point B. You're betwixt and between. That itself is wearying and tiring from a psychological standpoint. And so that's Oyef Yogeya. Below Yorei Elohim. And as I said, the people have questioned. So Amalek attacks you at moments of weakness. It could be physical weakness. It could be spiritual weakness. It could be a lack of self-confidence. It could be a sense of, I'm not sure that I can do it. Or It could be a lack of understanding. And an excellent example of that, where Amalek, in a sense, not that Amalek attacks in that case, but we fight with Amalek. And in the war against Amalek, what comes through is Israel's weakness. Yes, from an objective standpoint, Israel defeats Amalek in that battle. But the end of the story is actually Israel that seems to be defeated. And what story am I referring to, of course? That's the Haftorah that we read on Parshat Zachar. That's chapter 15 of Shmuel. That's the story of King Saul's war against Amalek. From every objective standpoint, King Saul was commanded to destroy Amalek, all the men, women, children, animals, the works. And in the story, he wins the battle. He wins the battle handsomely, handily. But they took the better animals for themselves. He initially spares the king. And God and Shmuel confronts Shaul and says, you failed in your mission. God tears the kingship away from you. From any objective standpoint, it was a great victory. The book of Shmuel itself, by the way, refers to that as a great victory in the previous chapter. Vayas Chayil, Vayachet Amalek, Vayatzel et Yisrael, Mikol Shoseil. It's a great victory. But from a psychological standpoint, the story brings out the fact that Saul is unfit to be king. Doesn't have the right understanding of king. Maybe it's a lack of self-confidence, but it's a kind of weakness. It reminds me of the story of the snake in the beginning of the Chumash. God curses the snake. God condemns the snake. The snake is eternally the enemy of people who Yeshuv Charosh. And as I said, at the end of all that, and the snake is cursed forever and all that, scoreboard. Snake won, God nothing. It's the story of King Saul. Amalek, Agag won, he's going to be killed. Samuel kills him. Amalek won, Saul nothing. That's the scoreboard. Of course, Saul objectively wins. Of course he wins. Great victory. But the way the storyteller tells the story is not the case. So that's what I mean. Amalek attacks you at moments of weakness. Another wonderful example of that is Megillat Esther. What does Haman say to the king? Yeshno am echad mifuzar umufarad bein ha'amim b'chol medinot malchutecha. There's a nation out there, but they don't have their own state. There are 127 states, but the Jews have no state. They're scattered and dispersed amongst all the nations. Mifuzar umaforad, and therefore, says Haman, it's not worthwhile to keep them alive. And it's a small matter to get rid of them because they have no state. They have no army. They're scattered and dispersed. They're in exile. So it's easy for us to destroy them. That's Haman. That's Amalek. Mefuzar u'meforad. They're weak, he thinks. And therefore, we can defeat them easily. So that's the MO of Amalek. That's Vayavo Amalek. And the snake, we all know what the snake is. Snake attacks you with the heel. Hu Yeshuv Charosh, V'yatatu Shufenu Wakev. And as I mentioned before, the snake looks for the weakness, for the human being weakness, for God's weakness, which is the human being. And that's how the snake works. The trick is not to be weak. The trick is to be strong. Strength can be emotional, physical, spiritual. These are different areas in which if we fail in one, if we're weak in one, then Vayavo Amalek. So this is the Amalek. And again, as I mentioned, the Amalek of the snake is essentially God's enemy, also the human enemy, derivatively. But the snake of Esau's grandson, that's Israel's enemy. And I want to get back to that. Before I move further on here, I'll stop and take your comments and questions if anybody has comments or questions about anything that I've said so far.
Question in the chat from Ari, quote, along the lines of identifying the snake with a malak, that would then be the deeper meaning of Chazal's statement, Haman min haTorah minyan hametz
Minai, yes. Hamina Eis Asher Tziviticha. Yes, that probably is exactly the point of that. Taking Haman back, Hamina Eitz is exactly what the snake says. That is certainly the case. And I've said that many times myself, that the Midrashic statement, Haman min haTorah b'nai, where's Haman in the Chumash? funny question with someone in the Chumash, but it means, and the answer Hamina ate, Hamin, from the what, right? What God said to Adam, did you eat of that tree? Hamina ate. So in other words, the point is, what the Medrash is doing is taking us back to the story of the Eitz Hadat, which was my point. That's Haman. That's Haman's attempt to undo God's plan. Haman's attempt to attack the human being. Haman's attempt to attack God. The Midrashim, by the way, I would add, when it comes to Amalek, when it comes to Haman, okay, when you read the Midrash about Haman, and the fact of the matter is, the Midrash is simply, I think, reflecting what's in the book, that Haman sees himself as a kind of God. When the Gemara says, why did Mordechai not bow down to Haman? What's the prohibition? People in the Bible bow down all the time to other people. There's no prohibition. Well, why didn't he bow down? He didn't bow down, and look at all the trouble he got into. So the Gemara's answer is, well, maybe he was wearing some kind of idolatrous symbol on something on himself. But the point that the Medrash is getting to, I think, is Haman doesn't see himself as a human being. In other words, bowing down to another human is one thing. What if the human sees himself as godlike? Doesn't see himself as just another created being. Sees himself as the snake seems to see it. There's me and there's God. The two of us. In other words, the snake sees himself as almost God's equal. And there you run into idolatry. There you run into questions of idolatry. So that's in other words, the Medrash is presenting Haman not primarily as enemy of the Jews. Haman is the enemy of humanity, but Haman is also God's enemy. Because when you see yourself as God's equal, that's when you get into trouble. And that's when you think that you can dispense justice as any way that you feel is right. Or basically, anybody who slights you in the least is guilty of some cardinal sin. If they offended Haman, right? That's the point of the Megillah. Yes.
Something else you said sparked an interesting idea, or I think interesting, when you were just talking about bowing. Right before, of course, you were talking about the weakness and Haman attacks us if we're weak on any of those levels. And it could be that bowing is fine, but not when bowing appears to be showing a sign of weakness to someone who capitalizes on that.
That could be so. That's right. It could be so. The bowing of Mordechai in particular, by the way, is interesting, but that takes us to a different place, because it's lo yichrav lo yishtachaveh. It's not just bowing. Lo yichrav lo yishtachaveh could suggest bowing to a deity. Or we say in Olenu l'shabeach, nachnu korim mishtachavim. It's not l'shtachavot is one thing, but agreed. Anything which reinforces the sense that Haman is above humanity, and the very way Haman is presented, and Amalek is presented. Reshit goyim Amalek. The very name Agag, which is a funny name. Agag is the head of Amalek. Agag is connected, no doubt, to the word Gog, which is the roof, which is the top. Haman is Gidal HaMelech HaChashret Haman Vayinasehu. Vayosim et Kiso Me'alko Asarim Asherito. The highest of the high. And that's when we get into trouble, when we see ourselves as the highest of the high, and then we think we're literally above everybody else. And you say playing into that by bowing down is reinforcing the belief of Haman that he's some kind of deity, that he's above everybody else. And that's why it's forbidden to bow down. It's not just that you're acknowledging, but you're actually playing into something which is central to Haman, and that is his status as somehow being above. But it's interesting that in the Megillah, by the way, and again, I don't want to get into the Megillah because I will talk about it endlessly, but one of the key words in the Megillah, actually, several key words, but one of the absolute key words of the Megillah is the verb to fall down. Lipol, nafal. He peel poor. Appears in many places in the Megillah. Haman nofel al hamita, right? You have it we have it in the Megillah in several places. Lahapil, to fall down. In other words, Haman starts being the highest, but the fall of Haman plays exactly off this point of being raised up. By the way, you have it with Amalek in the Chumash, right? Reshit goyim Amalek, right? V'yorom me'agag malko v'tina se malchuto. Billow's prophecy. V'yorom me'agag. He's even higher than Agag, higher than the roof. V'tina se malchuto. Israel shall be raised up. So you have the idea of raising up and falling down already in the prophecies of Bilam, and the Megillah takes this idea and it runs with it. Okay. Anybody else for comments about what anything I've said so far? Okay, let me move on to the Amalek, who is the grandson of Esav, Esav's grandson. Turns out that story of Yaakov confronting Esav is this week's parsha. So the next few words that I say can be seen as a shir on the book of Shemot, and also a shir on Parshat HaShavua, because that's where we have Esav and Yaakov. And let me just say something about Yaakov and how Amalek, one way to understand Amalek. And I want to be very clear about this at the end. I'm not here to vindicate Amalek, far from it. But I want to understand Amalek, okay? At least one phase of Amalek as the Torah presents it. Because Amalek appears as Esav's grandson. He's also the snake, and those are two different things. The story of Esav and Yaakov and Amalek can be understood in the context of the Yaakov story. So the Torah tells us that we know this from Parshat Toldot. Yaakov and Esav are basically twins. They're twins. And before they're born, Rivka goes to inquire what's going on over here. So Rivka goes to inquire of God, and she gets the response: the two nations inside you, one shall be more powerful than the other. Which is understood, and I think the pshat is that one will be stronger than the other. It's what Yitzchak says to Esau when after Yaakov takes the blessing. Is it only one blessing, Father? And Yitzchak's answer is, there's one blessing. What can I do? But you know what? Sometimes you'll get the blessing. Whenever you have the ability, you can remove the yoke from your neck. And the point is, so there's always going to be a struggle, but sometimes you'll be predominant, sometimes you'll be more powerful, and sometimes the other side will be more powerful. Yaakov. That's what. Yeah. So therefore, this idea of the Omi Amatz, that they're constantly going to be a struggle between you and your brother for supremacy or whatever, that seems to be a plain reading of the Chumash and reinforced by what Yitzchak says to Esav. Now,
Rabbi
Silber, yes.
Hashem also empowered Hagar in that discussion. This, he made sure she knew there would be a great power. He had done that earlier.
What do you mean Hagar?
Hagar, like when he spoke to her when she was in the Sadeh, and she was not going to some slave to Ishmael. He empowered her to know. Yeah.
Right. No. Right. That's true. But the point is that in the case of Ishmael, that's true. That God says Ishmael is going to be okay and he's going to be a powerful nation and all that. That's true. Mm-hmm. But there's not a sense in the Chumash that Ishmael is going to be Israel's enemy. One never gets that sense. Never says that. With Esav and Yaakov, Esav is Yaakov's enemy. That's the point. Now, here's the point. Yaakov, what is the picture of Yaakov that we get when we read the Chumash? When I say we read the Chumash, I don't mean we read the Chumash with Rashi. When you read the Chumash with Rashi in Parshat Toldot and Vayetze, you get a very different picture of Yaakov and Esav. When we read the plain Chumash, what it actually seems to say, minus the apologetics and all that, what does it say about Yaakov and Esav? First of all, what's interesting is that when they're born with Yaakov holding on to Esav's heel. Yodo ochezet ba'akev Esav. Perhaps to show that he wants to be first. They're twins. They're born essentially at the same time. One comes out first. So Yodo ochezet ba'akev Esav. Okay. And then we have the story of the birthright, where Yaakov will purchase the birthright, establishing himself as the firstborn. Esav sells the birthright to Yaakov either for something or for a bowl of soup. That's not totally clear. It's clear the bowl of soup is important, either to finalize the deal, maybe that's actual the sale. In Vayivez Esav et ha'bechorah, so Esav squandered the birthright. Okay, Esav sells a birthright for a bowl of soup. Esav seems not to care very much about the birthright. He says, what do I care about birthrights? I could die tomorrow. I live in the present. I live in the moment. I'm not thinking about the future. That's the story. But what is this picture of Yaakov? What is the picture of Yaakov? So Yaakov, Vayozed Yaakov Nazid. Yaakov, Nazid, Nazidim are lentils. He lentiled lentils. He creates, he's cooking up a lentil stew. Is that an accident? And Esav happens to come for supper? It's the translation that JP has. So it occurred that he came, or no? It's not an accident. It's a plan. It's not a shogeg, it's amazing. By Yozed Yaakov Nozid. I think it's a plan. He cooks up a scheme. He knows his brother. And his brother comes back to the field. Vayavo Esav ben Hasodeh v'hu ayev. He's tired. Ayev doesn't just mean tired over there because he's actually more hungry than tired. So ayev means he's tired and he's hungry. And in Esav's head, he has to eat now. Lives in the moment. He says, pour that stuff down my gullet. He says, how he tamed that red stuff, pour it down my gullet. The Torah presents Esav as a rather crude person. The Midrash should pick up on this. Vayivez Esav et ha'bechorah. Vayivez is a negative term. And he's a hunter. The Torah doesn't like hunters. That's all true. But in the story, his brother comes back famished.
And Yaakov is sly.
Yaakov,
Sly is cunning.
yes, by Yozed Yaakov Nazir, he's not a violent person. He's an ish tam, but it hardly means perfect. In the Medrash, maybe in the liturgy, it may mean that, but it means not violent. It's the opposite of Yodei Tzayid. Esav's a hunter. Esav's a killer. Yaakov is not. Yaakov is a non-violent person. But non-violent people can behave in devious ways. But Yazid, he takes advantage of the fact that he is tired. And takes advantage of the fact that he knows his brother. His brother is going to sell a birthright for nothing because he's hungry now. He may change his mind 3 hours later, but right now he's going to sell the birthright. What do I need birthrights for? I'm starving to death. Or maybe it means every day I go out to a job. I know if I'm going to come back the next day. Think I can think about the future? I can't think about the future. That's how Yaakov gets the birthright. By the way, I'll come back to another point I saw recently, which I thought was very interesting. But we could have a whole shir on this itself, but I'm not going to, can't spend the time on it now. That's the one story. That's the Bechorah. And then we have the bracha in the chapter 27. Yaakov gets Yitzchak to give him the blessing. Now, Yaakov, the one who engineers everything is, of course, Rivka. She's the one who understands that Yaakov has to get this blessing. And she may be even right about that. But the way she goes about it is through manipulation and through deception. And Yaakov himself, by the way, raises at least an objection about going through this, of dressing up as Esav and getting the blessing. Now, Yaakov's objection is not on moral grounds. It's not right to do it. He says, maybe my father will figure out I'm not Esav and he'll curse me. Okay. Yaakov is hesitant to do it, okay? If not on the best grounds. But he goes ahead and does it. His mother, no, you do what I tell you to do, she says. Just listen to me. Don't worry about being, he curses you, the curse is on me. Yaakov goes in there, and it's clear in the story. I can't go into the story. The art of the Chumash is remarkable. He doesn't exactly know what to say, How come you're back so soon, my son? What does Yaakov say? Ki hikra Hashem Elohecha lefanai. Ki hikra Hashem Elohecha lefanai. Chapter 27. Hikra Hashem Elohecha. God chanced it before me. Of course, Rashi, the great apologist for the Jewish people, and Esav says, and yet Yitzchak says, is that Esav? Says Rashi, he would never mention God's name. So Yaakov speaks, God mentions God's name. On the other hand, And there's something to that. Could be there's something to that, but what is the context in which Yaakov mentions God's name? It's the context of trying to trick his father, and not just his father. But the point is not just his father, but the important point is his blind father. To take advantage of the other one's weaknesses. That's what you have in the two stories. One is the brother who lives for the moment, who is Ayef, who's tired. And the other is the pious Isaac, who cannot see and tries every which way to compensate for the fact that he can't see. The smell, the touch, the voice. He's trying to compensate. But Yaakov is able somehow to convince Yitzchak. Yitzchak has his doubts, but he convinces him that it is in fact Esau. Now, what is common to both stories is something else. It's just in passing, I want to make this point. And that is that in each of the two stories, you have, in a sense, the invocation of God's name. Because in the first story, remember when Yaakov says to Esau, I'll give you the soup, but sell me your birthright. What do I need birthrights for? I'm going to die anyway. Says Yaakov, Hishavali, swear to me. What is it? What's an oath? You're saying it in God's name. Hishavali kayom. In the second case, once again, the invocation of God's name. How come you're back so fast? Because I have God's help. God is helping me. Ikra Hashem Elohecha lefonai. Come in. Are you Esau? Says Rashi. Esau doesn't talk about God. But my point is, okay, that may be the case. But what is the context in talking about God? In both stories, invoking God's name in the context of deception. Now, here's what I'll tell you. This is a personal statement. That's a quality that I can't stand, actually. That's something that bothers me. When they use God's name to advance something which is dubious, I find that not a sign of piety. I find it a sign of deep impiety. But here's the point. It's a great story, that second story, because it's clear that Yaakov is very uncomfortable where he is for whatever reason. First of all, Esau will come back any minute, and he doesn't actually know what to say. He doesn't know what to say. In other words, who are you? Oh, I'm Esau. I've done everything you told me to do. You know, it's like sometimes we used to take a test in high school and you don't know the answer. So you can talk in a language that says actually nothing, but you go on saying nothing. I did all that you told me to do. You know what I mean? Because he doesn't really know what to do. He's not a hunter. He's an ishtam. He doesn't know anything about this. So he has to fake it. Anyway, here's my point. Esau forgives Yaakov. That's what it sounds like in this week's parsha. He forgives Yaakov. He even offers to help Yaakov. He forgives Yaakov. But there's a piece of Esau that doesn't forgive Yaakov. And that piece of Esau that doesn't forgive Yaakov, one of those pieces is actually Amalek. And Amalek attacks Yaakov, attacks Israel in the words of the Chumash, Bi'ato Oyef v'Yogeya, when you are Oyef. The Chumash, Jacob, why are you back so fast? Because God enabled me. God chanced it before me. They chanced upon you on the path. So Amalek is the piece that doesn't forgive Jacob. And here's the point. Here's the deep point about the parsha. The Chumash doesn't forgive Jacob either. But what the Chumash says is he's not just Jacob. The point of this week's parsha, the great struggle of Jacob, is the transformation of Jacob into Israel. As Israel, he crosses over to the other side. If he stays Jacob, he never crosses over. The whole point of the parsha is he is able to transform himself through the struggle, through the wound. He transforms himself to become Israel. Amalek is the piece of Esau that doesn't believe in that. It doesn't accept the repentance. It doesn't accept the transformation. Amalek is the piece who sees Jacob as the same Jacob who takes advantage of the fact that Esav is a Yef, that takes advantage of Isaac's weakness. And that Jacob, that quality of taking advantage of the weakness of the other, whether it's the weakness of his perception of Esav, or his sense of living in the moment, or whether it's Isaac's physical limitation. Taking advantage of someone's weakness. Who does that? In one word, we know who does that. That's the snake. It's hardly an accident that when Jacob is born, he's holding on to Esav's heel. Who attacks you with the heel? That's the snake. That's how the Torah presents Jacob, or a piece of Jacob. That's the manipulation. That's the figuring out the weakness of the other and taking advantage. And there's more to be said about that too. And I can't get into that now. I will say that that's Pshuto Shamikra in my view. And the ones who understood this actually, they've taken it a completely different direction. But the ones who understood this best, I think, are actually the Kabbalistic texts. They understood that Jacob appears initially as the snake. Now, there's the transformation, and there's also the claim that's being made is that Jacob has to get, there are two different blessings. Isaac only knows of one blessing. For Isaac is one blessing, but that's another different conversation. But that Yaakov also has to be Esav in a sense. But that's a whole other direction. But the point I want to make about this Amalek, the grandson of Esav, the grandson of Esav has it in for Yaakov. He doesn't believe in Israel altogether. He doesn't believe in that transformation. The Chumash makes that point, but he remembers the first Jacob. He remembers Vayavo Esav ben Asadeh v'hu Ayef. That's true of the grandson of Esav. That's not true of the Nachash. The Nachash isn't really directly connected to Yaakov at all. Yes, the Nachash will attack Jacob because Israel is God's beloved. So when attacking God, you can't defeat God directly. You will defeat God by attacking God's beloved. And I want to make one more point about Amalek, then I'll stop and take questions. And then next week, we can talk about Amalek a lot. Amalek is, to me, one of the central ideas of the Bible. And one of the central ideas of life, actually, the presence of this evil. But I want to make one last point about Amalek. And that's the following point. I just mentioned it now. Maybe next week we'll talk more about it. Comes back to this week's parsha. Why is that? Vayavo Amalek. Yes, they come at a moment of weakness. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. They come at a moment of weakness. But what is their goal? What is the goal of Amalek? So the goal of Amalek actually is the goal of the snake. What is the goal of the snake? The goal of the snake is to defeat God's plan. But what is God's plan in the Chumash? God's plan is to create a space where the human being and God can dwell together. That's the plan. That's a plan always, actually. But the Gan Eden was God's initial attempt, which fails because of human failure. We can't dwell in God's space. And therefore we're banished from God's space. And we search for a kind of alternate space. But that's the goal of the goal is to preclude sacred space. That's the goal of the Nachash. And that's the point of Vayavo Amalek. Vayavo Amalek appears in chapter 17. Chapter 18 already is preliminary. Well, 18 is an in-between chapter, but chapter 19 already is Kabbalat Torah, and the rest of the book is about building the Mishkan, building the sacred space. Standing at Sinai before God, building the sacred space. Vayavo Amalek. Amalek tries to prevent you, tries to stop you from reaching your destination. In this week's parasha, actually, there's another character who, in a sense, is a snake-like figure initially, also undergoes a transformation. And that character is this mysterious person, angel, that confronts Jacob and tries to prevent Jacob from crossing over. Jacob has to cross over the Yabok, to receive the blessing. But Vayovek Ishimo Adalot HaShachar, this being wrestles with Jacob until the dawn. And in that wrestling with Jacob to the dawn, is to stop him from crossing over, from being a recipient of the blessings, of the covenantal blessings. And in that story, Jacob actually transforms himself. And when he transforms himself, then suddenly this being who came to destroy him actually blesses him. The being is a kind of mirror. The being is a reflection of Yaakov. Initially, the being, what does it say about the struggle? Vayeyovek ishimo adalot hashachar, the being Vayeyovek wrestled with him. But the word Vayeyovek, Aleph Bet Kuf, what is Vayeyovek? What does Vayeyovek mean to wrestle? So they explain, because it has the word avak, Aleph Bet Kuf. What is avak?
Dust,
Avak
dust.
is dust, right? Avak is dust. Avak is afar, right? Who dwells in the dust in the Chumash?
Snakes.
The snake, of course. Afar tochal kol yemei chayecha. When the being first comes to confront Jacob, the being comes as the snake. Because the being is a mirror of Jacob, actually, or a piece of Jacob. But by the time the struggle has come to a conclusion, he's a different person. He's a different being. Because Jacob is a different being. Jacob has become Israel, not Akov, not Akuv, go around, but Yashar, Yasharel, Yeshurun. And then the being reflects that. And the being is blessing the new Jacob, who then crosses over to the other side. The Amalek is the piece that doesn't buy it. What do you mean he changes? There's no such thing. We don't believe in change. It's the same Jacob. But the Torah suggests otherwise. The Torah suggests he's become Israel. And Amalek tries to block you from moving forward. In the case of Jacob, it's the being that wants to prevent Jacob from crossing over to get the covenantal blessing. In the case of the Chumash here, to prevent you from building God's temple. The snake of the Eden, to destroy God's temple, the plan of one space in which God and human being inhabit. And the Vayavu Amalek, in that context, is the same thing, basically to stop us from standing at Sinai and to prevent us from building the Mishkan. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this. I got plenty to say about this, but I'll stop at this point. These are, to me, some of the central, the central ideas of the Bible, actually. This week's parsha is Jacob becoming Israel. It's central. But it takes us back. It always goes back to Genesis. It always goes back to the beginning of the book. Okay, I'll stop at this point and take any comments or questions. We have 2-3 minutes.
Okay, Sandra, I have a question. Just to do a riff on the twinning of Esav and Yaakov. So we keep seeing that it's Yaakov who's approaching in an Akev kind of way his brother when he's Ayef and Yageh. And of course, we see this mirrored in Exodus 17. So could you say, is it just another way of saying what you're saying, that Jacob, being the twin of Esav, who becomes essentially Amalek, he's already got the Amalek in him. He's already attacking his brother for the birthright with the nazid, with the lentil soup. He set it up. That thing was ready. He knew the path his brother was coming on. He knew he was going to be tired. He was going after him when he was Ayef and Yageh. I mean, that's Amalek instantiated right there. So can we say that Yaakov has the Amalekness in him, like Esav does, and it's only when he struggles with the Ish, who is essentially really Amalek, the Nachash. Okay, this is one small victory. If you say in Genesis 3, it's God 0, Amalek, Nachash 1, could you say that at the end of Vayishlach, Parshat Vayishlach, when he has a victory over the Ish, who's the Nachash when he's in the dust, could you say that it's maybe Yaakov 1, Nachash 0? I mean, has he evened it out here? That because I see Jacob as being Amalekish, like Esav is, right there at the book.
I'll talk about that somewhere down the road when we get to the a different story about whether Amalek can be seen as something within every person. The Hasidic teachers claim that everybody has Amalek within every person.
Right, but I'm not talking Hasidishi. I'm talking just the words of the Chumash. I mean, if he attacked his brother when he was Ayef and Yagea, and we're supposed to look very carefully at the repetition of these key words, and Amalek, one of Amalek's key characteristics is attacking Israel, Ayef and Yagea, and the stragglers in our chapter in 17 Exodus. Aren't we supposed to see Yaakov pre-transformation in Parshat Vayishlach? Aren't we supposed to see that Yaakov acted Amalek-like, but eventually
that's my point. That's the whole point
I'm
of my
saying, but it's
fear.
right in front of us. He's acting like the snake, and then he has to defeat the snake in Parshat Vayishlach.
Right, that's exactly my point. True. They're making a different point, that actually this question as to whether Amalek is within us, forget Yaakov. I think there's another story in the Chumash which suggests that Amalek is not something just outside us, not just an external enemy, but a kind of internal state. We'll get to that later on. That's another whole story. But yes, that's exactly my point. And that at least the Amalek of Esav is the Amalek who has it in for Yaakov. The Nachash is not about Yaakov. The Nachash is about humanity, as God says. Anybody else for a comment here?
Yes, I wanted to speak on behalf of Yaakov. Shmuel Klitzner points out in his book, Wrestling with Jacob, that Yaakov says the word Ulai Yimusheni Avi, which in some sense indicates that he wanted to be caught, because he could have said Pen Yimusheni Avi, that when he's speaking, he wanted his father to touch him, because that would have stopped the entire ruse from going on.
I'm familiar with the book. Let me just say very bluntly, I don't buy it, period. I also think that I know Shmuel Klitzner very well. I actually like him. But the fact is, I think he over-psychologizes. I think he makes too much emphasis on the Akedah. But no, I don't see that at all in the story. He doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want to get caught, and he's concerned. I don't think Pen and Ulai, I wouldn't build a case on that at all. No, I think he is very uncomfortable doing it. That is for
Right.
sure. He doesn't have the right words. That's all true. But when he objects to his mother, he doesn't say, "Mom, that wouldn't be right." He doesn't say that. He says, "Maybe you'll catch me," was what he says. Now, you could make the argument, he's not going to say that. Sometimes you tell someone one reason because someone asks you to do something that's immoral. You don't want to tell them, "That's immoral, I can't do it." So you make some other excuse. That is true.
Okay.
Sometimes that happens. It's not impossible, but the plain reading, I think, is. I mean, I'm comfortable with what I said. I think that he's problematic. I think that's the point of the story. I think I think that that's true in that story. I think in this last week's in the Parshas Vayetze, which is brutal beyond belief, terrible stuff there. And Rashi puts this gloss over all of it. You know what I mean? It's
right. Agreed.
Having read Parshat Toldot and Parshat Vayetze, I got to say openly, I wonder if we wouldn't be better off without Rashi, at least not as children. I think maybe you read Rashi when you're much older, and then you try to figure out the midrashim. Because when you read Rashi, the stuff it sucks all the life out of the stories. You know what I mean? It's clear that these are brutal stories about terrible relationships, and Rashi has this gloss he puts on the whole thing. So Rashi hates Esav. Esav's the worst guy who ever lived. And
He whitewashes Yaakov, right?
Right. And the fact of the matter is that the bad stuff he says about Esav, it's not true of Esav, that he's deceiver, he's this. It's true on Yaakov. Actually, that's what's
source
crazy
of evil.
about it. But no, I don't think that we could psychologize all we want on some deep level. He wants to get caught. To me, that comes under, but that's whatever. To me, that I don't go for that kind of stuff. I think that's not really. That's over psychologizing the text. Someone called psychobabble, but I would say I don't think that it's there in the text at all. On some deep level, he wants to get caught, maybe on some deep level he won, but I don't think it comes through in the text. It's not what he says. He says, "Mom, I can't do this. He's going to catch me." Don't worry, kid. Whatever the bad stuff's on me. Just do what I tell you to do. Now, I say what makes it a great story is she's not wrong about the fact that Rivka's not wrong about the fact that the covenantal blessing cannot go to Esav. He's married to Canaanite women. It's about suffering in the present and reward in the future for somebody else. So she's 100% right about that. It's just the way she goes
It's how
about
she
it.
goes about it.
And she is, in fact, in the beginning of Parashat Tolda, let's not forget, because Rashi says the opposite, of course, but 3 times it says the word Aram. She's the daughter of, she's Lavan's sister, basically. Says Rashi, not like them, not like those wicked people. She's
Sadekis.
She's Sadekis. And I say the opposite. That's exactly the point. She is like them in this respect. She's a manipulator. Why didn't she speak to Yitzhak directly? She's not going to do that. You know what I mean? It's like the old joke, which I leave it with, the guy who buys the house, and he says to his guy, he says to his wife, we're going to Shmerel tonight. He's going to ask me, we have this new house. He's going to ask me, what did you pay for the house? If I give him a big price, he'll say, what, the guy's so rich? So he asks me a million favors. If I give a low, tiny price, he'll say, what a schlepper. It's all he can afford. His wife says, why not just tell him the truth? I never thought of that. And that's the story of Rivka, Why does she? Because she's Lavan's sister. Why did I tell him directly? I never thought of that, That's the point of the Chumash. But she's 100% right, actually. That's the point. That's what makes it great. She's correct. But the way in which you do it does matter. And it sets into motion a series of events that makes Yaakov's life extraordinarily difficult. On the other hand, he's the covenantal hero. And I got to stop at this point. We'll continue next week with Amalek. Next week's the last of these sessions. But we pretty much get to Sinai. Maybe we'll start Parshat Yitro, because Yitro and Amalek are connected, of course.
Wonderful. Everything is. Thank you.
We'll start next week. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank
you, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Everyone, we will see you all next week for one last session before break for winter is month. There will be winter week classes from December 22nd through 25th. You can see on our website, drisha.org/classes. Take care and have a good day.